So this last panel is really devoted to reflection. Reflection on the previous panels of the day. What is a smart and sustainable city? Are there things that we haven't talked about? Are there ways in which we need to think more critically about the information that we've received today? And how is it that we also create something that we have not talked so much about, and that is caring cities, cities where we really encourage our humanity, where we think about the effects of our behavior on other people. And actually, it's very interesting in the contemporary political philosophy literature, we're beginning to see people talking about the necessity of political structures that encourage love. So Martha Nussbaum has a new book. She's an extraordinary political philosopher who talks about democracy and love. And so while we all are here because we believe that cities can be better organized and better run to mitigate their environmental effects and also create more sociability, some of the other questions I think that are important that I hope that the panel will have an opportunity to comment on as well is how do we create more civitas? How do we create, greater than the sum of its parts as humans who live in this space? So I will not repeat the bios of the people who are on the panel, since you do, that's why this is important, even though each one of them is enormously accomplished in their own right, and I would urge you to look them up and read their bios. And what we will do here is every panelist will give a few minutes of reflection on the day related to their own work and where they're coming from. I have provided a few questions, including, do you see a difference between smart cities and intelligent cities? And we, hopefully the questions will be able to walk through and help engage all of us into a final session that is not only their reflection, but much more of a dialogue with those of you who have sat through the day here, and hopefully we'll have a much more of a back and forth and with the panelists opportunity here. So I believe, why don't we start with Valerie, who actually has a PowerPoint that she would like to share, and then we'll move to Rob Krueger from Worcester Polytechnic University, and Thomas Princen, who's actually done some very inspiring writing on the question of sufficiency. Rob, I asked to come because your work talks about just sustainability questions. I think that we need to probe more deeply. And then, and Thomas is from the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Sustainability, and Valerie, we know. So thank you very much.
Well, hello again, this time as a different status. And what I would like to do for a few minutes is to share with you some insights from a major project that we carried out in the Jerusalem Institute on looking at what is sustainability for the future. And we were looking at a national level, but it could also be applied, and I'm going to show how it could be perhaps applied at a city level, and to raise and to come to terms with some of the issues on the social and behavioral sciences at the end. So we were looking to see what was sustainability outlook, and we put together a process. And what I would like to say for the first comment was, we've heard a lot of elements of what would be a smart and sustainable city. But the elements need to be part of a whole. And the first comment I would like to make was that we see smart and sustainable cities as a process, and not as individual elements standing alone. And the process in the example that I'm using as a basis, which could be applied at a national or city level, moved from understanding what the situation was in indicators and expert knowledge base, moved to understanding where we were taking ourselves. If we did not intervene in any different way, that would be a business as usual scenario. We did not like the business as usual scenario and where we were taking ourselves. We looked at alternative scenarios, which actually could come from different situations which we may have no control about. Then we put together a vision and asked afterwards, how do you move towards that vision? What were the kind of strategies, robust strategies, that could move us closer to the vision? And then we asked, how can you implement those strategies? And I'm going back to using the term policy packages, and Eran Feitelson was part of our team, and he mentioned policy packages in transportation, and he worked on the policy packages in this way. And I'm saying the same kind of thinking could lead us to thinking on a city level. And I'm going to take us through a series of slides as to show how that thinking could be implemented, and saying what the first item that we then put on the table was, what is your focus? What are you trying to focus on? And we decided to focus on environment, well-being, and resilience. Now, the term resilience has come up previously during today, and I would just like to say, please note that we did not put economic or economic growth or income or any a term like that in the center. It was, in our belief, something which was influence and influential, but that wasn't the center. So if we were looking for what we wanted, a good life, and I was happy to hear the mayor said what we're looking for is a good life. We're not putting economic growth at the center. We were looking at possible scenarios. They may be totally not within our possibility of saying what may happen, what will happen, but we should be aware of what could happen. It could be that we will carry on with a market-led neoliberal scenario, as is today. It could be that with the social demonstrations, as they were in 2011 around the world, that we will have a bottom-up approach in a totally different scenario of what the political context may be. We may have a different geopolitical context in our area of the world, if not in Los Angeles. So the question was, where is that context going to be? What are the scenarios that could be in front of us? And in a city context, we could say the same. Is it going to be dominated by markets? Will there be a bottom-up approach, which is more generated by collective and community action? Will it be dominated by perhaps technological developments and leading us to a different kind of world? When we looked at what were the implications of those kind of scenarios, a market scenario will lead us to strengthening the economic aspects, and the environmental aspects can link to that and can also be strengthened. But our indicators were that we will get a weakening of the social aspects, which are important, social inclusion and social related aspects, social cohesion. Whereas if we looked at a community mosaic, we will get an increased social side of collective community action, promotion of social enterprise, but we may lose out on economic growth. Are we prepared to accept that? Are we willing to accept that those are the kind of implications of scenarios that we may find ourselves? And therefore, we wanted to put together a vision of sustainability, whatever the scenario. Whatever the scenario we may find ourselves, what is the vision of sustainability that we want to lead ourselves to and we want to get to? It should be plausible, possible, not utopian. And then we asked ourselves, what are the strategies that are going to lead us to getting closer to the vision? And here I want to link up to the social and behavioral and political aspects of strategies for sustainability. Can we carry on with the level of consumption and the type of consumption and the way we're living? We came to the conclusion the answer is no. We have to be willing, prepared, and work out how we moved to more sustainable consumption, and we cannot carry on with the same kind of consumption. We have to move towards more community involvement and engagement. We have to move towards more alive and city centers. And then the strategies to policy packages, and who was going to carry out the policy package? Was it government? Was it the business community? Was it community packages? We put together several packages with leading instruments and supporting instruments, and asked, as Iran explained to us this morning in relation to the transportation packages, were they effective? Are they going to be acceptable? And from that, I want to lead on to our question that our chairman of the session posed to us, and I would like to then link it to the thoughts and to the insights which we are now following up together in the continuation of our research, which is leading us more into the social sciences and more deeply into behavioral and social sciences. And then we are finding that we have to come together and have to come to understanding the psychological research, which deals with attitudes, behavior, and choice of individuals in relation to changing consumption patterns. And we have to come to terms with the sociology theories and social sciences with social practice, and what are the social norms which we can link up to, which may be able to change social and cultural context for changing consumer behavior and being more sustainable consumption. To come to the context in the economic realm with people like Tim Jackson in the UK, who wrote a very important document called Prosperity Without Growth some years ago, and raised issues of where is the economic line. And lastly, to recall that there is also a governance aspect, and to say who governs the commons, who can be partners and the stakeholders and be engaged in the urban commons as part of the sustainable city, and who can be the co-city and cooperating between in governments. And the example here was from Bologna. And so with that, I would like to say if those words can be a little bit of an introduction to the discussions of our panel. Thank you.
Glad that these PowerPoints are going to be available so that we can look at them a second time. I'll pass it over to Bob Krueger.
Thanks, Stephanie. 20 years ago, the academic planner named Scott Campbell at the University of Michigan wrote that in the battle of big public ideas, sustainability is won. The task before us in the coming years is to simply work out the details. Let me share with you a few details that I learned earlier today. We learned about, in one of the early presentations, about Tyson's Corner in Washington, D.C., and about how it's a very integrated set of planning, master planning concepts that link, a strongly middle-class neighborhood to the Washington D.C. metro area, or in Washington D.C. area, but also out to the airport. But on the other side of that, there's a but. Just a few miles over the Maryland border is called the Bethesda Row development. In that development, it was a very rundown part of Bethesda, Maryland, where it was predominantly African American, predominantly renter-occupied housing, where the people were thrown out. On average, they found lower quality housing to live in that was much further away. Meanwhile, we have a beautiful, iconic development called Bethesda Row, that is essentially what one might call environmental gentrification. We heard earlier today about Boyle Heights, where very good idea, and I appreciate the effort, to bring solar power to communities in need. But then somebody mentioned Freiburg, Germany earlier today as a green city. I've spent a lot of time in Freiburg, and there's a development there called Boogie 50. And it's the first zero energy social housing project in Europe. Before the project began, it housed 106 families. After the project was complete, 4 of those families were able to remain in the social housing. Why? Because it was primarily a housing project for immigrants. The layouts weren't suitable to the types of families that were living in there. It wasn't based upon the nuclear family. The rents went up because of the modifications that were made to the building. I also think of Växjö in southern Sweden. Vaxjo, if you want to look at it on a map and you're from the US. It's a city that has a combined heat and power system. It's a small, medium-sized city that has a combined heat and power system that operates and provides cheap energy to the city center. Then I think of places like Barcelona which is a branded area in the Poblenou district in northern Barcelona, where it has the same type of energy and green accoutrement, but again, is a source of state-led environmental forms of gentrification. And so, I asked myself, those are the details, right? And what are we really trying to work on here? And I've got 4 points that I wanted to reflect upon as we move towards the end of our workshop. And first of all, is the notion that sustainability is a social construct. Just like the economy and the environment, the ideas of value change, the ideas of the role of the state change, and things like that. The way we understand and value the environment are different today than they were 20 years ago. So today we have to ask ourselves, what is it exactly that we're trying to sustain? And how do our current institutions, not the technologies that we use, but how do our current institutions reproduce this set of social relationships? So on that, following on from that, I would argue that we need to go back and think about sustainable development, not as we need to think of it as a normative concept. It means a certain set of things, as you pointed out in your talk. It's about environmental integrity, economic prosperity, and social equity. And we have to use that, I think, as a normative concept to measure and to hold accountable the institutions, whether it's markets or governments or private sector or nonprofits, who seek to promote goals of sustainable development. That we have to hold those folks accountable to all 3 of those domains, not just the economy, which is easy, not just the environment, which is becoming easier, also social equity. As somebody pointed out today, sustainability is a privilege of the middle class. Third, which was also pointed out in one of the first talks this morning, Mike Chester, there's no technological fix here. I mean, one of the earlier thoughts I had about this is that, to sort of riff on Scott Campbell's comment, is that in some ways when I started out in the first half of this day, I thought, well, we know all the answers. Everybody had a set of ideas about how we can move towards sustainability. And I think we do have a lot of technological fixes that are out there, but you cannot view those, as again Mike Chester pointed out, that outside of their techno-human relationship. The types of, reflecting on smart cities for a second, where we install sensors, what those sensors are, what they measure, is a techno-human relationship. Which software analyzes what? How we organize the data and analyze the data is a techno-human relationship. And finally, we can also learn from, as a human geographer, the mistakes that we made with GIS in terms of data visualization. We saw a lot of really cool visualizations today. But that, again, represents reality in some way that is a techno-human construct that we have to be aware of. Fourth, and I think finally, is we have to be aware of both culture and cultural shifts. We heard this morning about, in one of the early talks, about the way that Uber and Lyft help people get used to the idea of sharing transportation. I'm sorry, people in America used to the idea of sharing transportation again. That's a really interesting opportunity if you think about it. You know, as I said, you know, I qualified that in America. Well, people around the world have figured that out. But in America, with, you know, with suburbanization in the 1950s during the post-war boom, with the notion, you know, the Fordist relations of production, where everybody, you know, the nuclear family, a car in the garage, you know, living the American dream, that we have to retrain people, and we have to find ways in which we can do that. And if this Uber thing helps us get to the notion that we can share a car together, I guess I'm all for it. Another thing that in my own work, in looking at transition towns, I did some work in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And people, one of the things that really took off there, which really isn't such a big thing in the US, but it is in other parts of the world, is this notion of time banking, where people volunteer their time, hour per hour, to help somebody else with something. But the commodity here is not whether you're a doctor, you're an accountant, you're a GIS analyst or whatever. It's the amount of time that you put into it. And why did people come to this? Well, what people reported on in Massachusetts was they felt alienated, living in their suburban communities, that they couldn't ask their neighbors for help. They couldn't, we talked about the sharing economy in the last session. They couldn't ask, you know, everybody has a lawnmower, everybody has a weed whacker, a hedge trimmer, et cetera, et cetera. You can't ask your neighbor for that stuff. And they felt like by participating in this time banking scheme that they could reconnect with their community. Again, those are cultural shifts that are unique to the American experience. And then I think, too, finally, in terms of planning, we heard about green space development and things like that. I'm reminded of in the 1970s, one of my colleagues, Julian Edgeman, was an environmental consultant in London, and he was looking at, this is at the time when people were coming back from the Commonwealth, going to Great Britain to resettle, and he was doing a study of parks and the accessibility, the social inclusions aspects of parks. And what did the parks look like? And he looked at Richmond Park in particular. It's a beautiful park. But he was talking about people were coming from Ghana, from Nigeria, from Kenya, from Pakistan, from India, Bangladesh, coming to the UK to settle. And they were taking their extended families out for their Sunday picnic. But all the park benches, which are made of concrete, had seats for 4. And so we have to think about culture and the different ways our understanding of culture mediates how the forms that our landscape takes. And I guess finally, I want to say that we need to think about how sustainable development, whether it's in the smart city context or smart growth that we have in the United States or compact urban development or whatever it is that's out there, the concept of sustainable development is strategically used as a rhetorical device because it automatically promotes this notion that you have this set of concentric circles that somehow magically fit together. And we have to be aware of how those are used. And I'd like to see it get beyond just the rhetorical moves associated by branding certain activities as sustainable into real material manifestations on our landscape. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I think the challenge for this panel is that really they've spent the day thinking about these issues and putting their thoughts together. So I thought that was really very nice. And now we have Thomas.
Okay. So as the last speaker, I'll take it as my charge to wrap it all up and put it all together and make sense of everything, or something slightly less than that. What I'm going to try to do is step back a bit, try to draw a bigger picture, try to kind of frame much of what I heard anyway this morning and this afternoon. Some of that, I think, in the last panel engaged in some of this rethinking issue. Especially, I'm going to come at it from a biophysical, ecological perspective. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to pick up on a comment in the morning session about how so much of our approaches to environmental issues, to sustainability, are sort of 20th century environmentalism. And so I'm going to use that as a frame. I'm going to distinguish 20th century environmental action on the one hand from 21st century transition on the other, okay? And I do this on 6 different dimensions. I got more, but I'll just limit it if I can briefly to 6. The first is obviously a scale. So in the 20th century, environmental problems for the most part were local or national. Some were international in the sense of transboundary air pollution, for example. But in the 21st century now, environmental problems are, I think, inherently global. And I mean global in 2 important different ways. One is the obvious, that is geographically global, climate change being the obvious one. But in a different way, global in the sense that even the most local problems, whether it's solid waste or water supplies, whatever, they cannot be solved simply by passing the buck somewhere else, simply by displacing the problem. If you draw down, if a city draws down its own aquifer, it can't simply go to the next aquifer because it's already claimed. And you can't go to the next one because it's claimed. So it's global in the sense that you can't solve your environmental problems by going to the next valley, to the next forest, to the next grassland. Okay. Second difference is in terms of resource availability. The easiest way, I think, to see this is in terms of energy. The International Energy Administration, the big oil companies, they all say that the era of easy, cheap oil and other energy forms is over. Okay? What they tend not to say is it will probably have less available energy, but when they then talk about how costly it is to extract in the tar sands or deep sea, so forth, one of the implications is we'll simply have less availability as time goes on. And then we're going to, since so much of our resource extraction is dependent upon cheap and abundant energy, it's a very likely scenario that we'll simply have less total available natural resources available to us. So that era of cheap energy, what distinguishes the 21st century from the 20th, is that the era of cheap energy and natural resources is over. And I mean cheap in 3 ways. One is the obvious, like price at the pump kind of cheap. But the second is energetically cheap. In the 20th century, it took very little energy to get, let's say, oil out of the ground. Now it takes a lot of energy. And notice that's not an economic argument, that's strictly a biophysical, energetic argument. And the third was, it was cheap environmentally. You could always externalize so much of the true costs. Well, obviously, I think those true costs are coming back home to roost. So that era is over. In the 21st century, again, 21st century transition is about an era with less available and less cheap natural resources. Third, and this goes to one of the terms in the title of this conference is sustainability. What does that mean? We could spend the whole conference on that one, of course, and I won't belabor it, but just to say that in the 20th century, it could easily mean improving environmental conditions, reducing impact, which is generally always a good thing. But if, let's say, you're losing topsoil at a rate of 100 tons per year, if you improve that to 99 tons per year, reduce the rate of erosion, you're still eroding it. Over time, over the long term, which to me defines as sustainability, you get down to bedrock. Sustainability in the 20th century was about reduction, and I think I heard a lot of references to reduction here. I think in the 21st century, it's about capping. It's about looking at the capacities of ecosystems to generate resources. It's about the capacities of waste sinks to absorb them. And so when we heard one presentation, I think it's about water, and this may be the easiest place to see it, is that you can't call a water supply system sustainable if your withdrawal rates exceed your recharge rates. I mean, it's just so obvious. Now imagine trying to extend that to soil, biodiversity, and other resources. We see fisheries that the mayor talked about. So again, I think a more rigorous notion of sustainability in the 21st century is one that recognizes capacities. Fourth, that takes us then, I think, to a notion of what do we mean by an economy? What is an economy beyond that which is measured by GDP and trade flows and so forth? I think what we've had in the 20th century and before is primarily an extractive economy, a mining economy, and not just mining minerals and mining fossil fuels, but mining soil and mining aquifers and so forth. Okay. I think almost by definition, that cannot be sustained. And the 21st century challenge is to develop an economy that is sustaining, okay, as well as just as Rob has raised. That then takes us to questions of metrics. I think the dominant metrics of the 20th century have been monetary, cost-benefit, and that needs to shift to something that's deals with biophysical capacity. And again, I think water is the easiest place to see this. But also something that deals with metrics that deal with societal integrity. Again, Rob mentioned reconnection. The people really long to be connected, not only to each other, but to the very resources that sustain themselves. That would be a very different kind of metric, I think, than what has been dominant in the 20th century. Finally, then, a question of values. And I think Valerie raised this and others. And the way I would frame it from a decision-making perspective is we have to be very careful about the social organizing principles in which values are embedded in proposing interventions and advocating a particular theory of social change. As I read it, the dominant social organizing principles of the, what I'll call 20th century, have been efficiency, consumer sovereignty, that is what consumers want, is what gets produced in an economy, and above all, growth. Okay. I think in the 21st century, that's going to have to shift. The mayor talked about this, with this relentless drive for growth. And it's one thing if that growth is somehow non-material and it's a growth in well-being or growth in equity, but from everything I can tell, the growth that we have, economic growth that we have, is tightly coupled to material throughput, and that cannot grow forever on a finite planet. And so we need a new set of social organizing principles. And I would put up there at the top, and they themselves have to embody certain principles that are consistent with the fact that we depend on ecosystems, we depend on the hydrologic system, the hydrologic cycle. We depend on the climate, climate stabilizing effects of the oceans and the atmosphere. And that somehow has to be built into the principles. And efficiency, growth, and consumer sovereignty do not have, in my view, ecological content. I would nominate sufficiency as one way of approaching a different kind of social organizing principle. And I won't be able to develop it here, but I'll just give you my current definition. Sufficiency is doing well now and into the distant future by organizing to do less than the most possible now. Okay. I'll just say it one more time. Sufficiency is doing well now and into the distant future by organizing, and here's the connection to organizing principles, by organizing to do less than the most possible now. A general principle, much like efficiency and growth. And then along with that, other principles of justice or equity. I think these are they don't have to have a cost benefit on them. They are absolutely need to be in the forefront. And as the mayor mentioned, the good life. Ecuador has already enshrined in its constitution, buen vivir, as a notion of good life, irrespective of costs and benefits, at least it was measured in monetary terms. And that's part of their attempt to move to a post-petroleum Ecuador. So I think I better leave it there. That's my cut.
Thank you.